Well, good evening and welcome to our Sunday evening Bible class for the evening. We had a good worship service this morning at the building for our first time in more than 2 months. Glad to be back and to be with people. You know, I've heard it all my life, and I've said it frequently myself, that most of the time preachers are preaching more to themselves than to their audiences. Well, over the past several weeks, as we've been doing these Facebook Live messages, I am indeed looking myself straight in the eye. That's what happens when you do a Facebook Live. So this morning it was very good to look out on an audience and to see live people, even though they were behind masks. And of course that was due to the governor's guidelines. And on behalf of the elders, I think I can speak this very freely. Thank those of you who were there this morning for following the guidelines. The pictures that were taken from the front and back of the auditorium very clearly showed how the seating arrangement was and how people were sitting either as couples or as families with sufficient space in between. Everybody wearing their face mask as they should. Social distancing as far as the visiting was concerned. I thought everybody was doing a very, very good job of following those guidelines and keeping things as safe as we possibly can. So thank you all for doing that. If you have your Bible open, I would like for you to turn with me to the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John. We're going to be reading the first 9 verses here in just a few moments. We won't be looking in detail at Jesus and the woman at the well. We'll save that for Wednesday night. But for tonight, we're going to introduce Jesus in Samaria. Now, as we begin reading, we're going to, like I said, read through verse 9. And actually, it's only the latter part of verse 9 we're going to be mentioning besides verses 1 through 6. But to get the context and to get before our minds what's going on here, let's read these several verses, and then we'll go back and make some observations about it. Beginning John chapter 4 and verse 1, the Bible says here that when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" And then notice this, the last part of verse 9, the parenthesis, for the Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. So we opened the chapter. Remember last time we were looking at the questions that John had been answering, John the Baptizer, that is, toward the end of John chapter 3. And notice that, remember, somebody came asking a question about purification that essentially had to do with baptism, and especially the fact that even though John had baptized Jesus, now more people were being baptized by Jesus than by John. And as we pointed out then, it appears as if they may have been trying to stir up the spirit of competition of John toward Jesus. He would have none of it. Remember, that's the context where he makes the classic statement, he, that is referring to Jesus, must increase, but I must decrease. And so they were unsuccessful in stirring that up. But now to open chapter 4, when Jesus heard that the Pharisees were hearing this about him, he decides to withdraw. He's not ready yet for especially the showdown with the Pharisees. That's going to come. It's going to come soon enough. And he's not backing away from it in the sense of being afraid of them, but it's just the fact that the time is not right. We see that so many times in the Gospel of John. It's not said explicitly on this occasion, but we can surmise that the time just wasn't right for that. So Jesus was going to go back for Galilee. And it says in verse 4, he had to pass through Samaria. He had to pass through Samaria. Well, now we need to ask the question, was it a geographical, chronological, or moral necessity that was placed upon Jesus? Well, obviously, if you're in Judea, if you look at a map, you're in Judea, you want to go to Galilee, Samaria lies in between them. And so the shortest distance between Judea and Galilee would indeed be to go through Samaria. But as we saw there in verse 9, since the Jews did not have dealings with the Samaritans, the vast majority of the Jews, if they were going from Judea to Galilee or from Galilee down to Judea, they would cross the Jordan River and then go down the east side of the Jordan River and then cross back again into Judea, or if they were going the other direction, they'd go up to the north and cross back over into Galilee. But they did not, in that sense, have to go through Samaria. So when the Bible here says that he had to pass through Samaria, I don't believe that it was because of something that was geographical. He could avoid it if he wanted to. Perhaps chronological, in other words, due to a certain time frame. He needed to be in Galilee at a certain time, so to take the shortest route, get there at the quickest, he would have to go through Samaria. That's a possibility. I think more likely, and especially from the context as we will continue reading Wednesday night, I believe it has more to do with that third option, that it was a moral necessity. A moral necessity in the sense that there was an appointment there to keep. There was a woman there that he needed to talk to who was going to be his door, so to speak, or his window of opportunity to teach a whole village or a whole town there in Samaria, the town of Sychar. And so when we look at that expression, he had to go through Samaria. Let's keep that in the back of our minds as we're going to be going through this lesson. But when John says there, the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans, that makes us kind of piques our curiosity. It makes us stop and want to ask, well, who are these Samaritans and what's the history here, and why, if they live in such close proximity, why are there no dealings between the two? Why is there so much animosity? Well, we need to go back to the Old Testament in order to answer that question, or at least to begin to answer that question. And if you look all the way back to 2 Kings chapter 17, 2 Kings chapter 17 and verses 24 to 41, we won't take the time to read the text there, but summarizing it, what's happened is the Assyrians have, for 3 different times, come down and they've taken certain sections of the northern kingdom of Israel. They began by on the east side of the Jordan River, taking Gilead and the tribes of half tribe of Manasseh and Reuben and Gad. Then they came down a second time, and they took some more of the northern kingdom, more around the Sea of Galilee. And then finally, they destroyed the city of Samaria, and they dispersed that northern kingdom. You know, when we hear the word decimation, we think of that as something that is absolutely terrible and awful, and it is, because it means that if going into a battle, 10% of those men going into battle are going to be casualties. Well, what God promised through the prophet Amos was not that 10% would be taken into captivity. He promised instead that only 10% would be left in Samaria, in that area, in the northern kingdom, and the 90% would be dispersed. And that's what the Assyrians did. What they did then to replace the population was to bring other conquered peoples in and settled them there. And what you read in 2 Kings chapter 17 is that these conquered peoples who came in and settled in that area not only brought their language and their culture, they also brought their religion. They brought their false gods. Well, as they were settled there, they learned something about the God of Israel, and so they just incorporated that into the worship of other gods. It's called syncretism. It's a blending together. You put a whole bunch of different religious beliefs together, you mix them all up, sort of like putting them in a blender, and out comes a philosophy, or out comes a religion, or you just add something else to the religion. And that's what those people had done. Well, that's the background of the population in that region of Samaria. It goes all the way back to the Assyrian captivity, back in the 8th century BC. And then we find also that after the captivity, even after the southern kingdom had been taken by the Babylonians, remember then they were allowed by the Persians to go back and to rebuild their temple. And then Ezra was sent back later to restore the law and to teach the law. And then Nehemiah was sent to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. And in Nehemiah chapter 13, you find that when the wall was being built, remember there were the people of the area there, and especially a man by the name of Sanballat, who was a Samaritan. He was kind of governor or one of the chief leaders of that area. Remember, he and several others were making fun of, and in other ways trying to make life miserable for those Jews who had returned and were rebuilding their temple and their city and their wall. So that adds to the animosity. Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 28. And that also then continued on, that in the time between the Old and the New Testaments, that intertestamental period, the Samaritans and the Jews, not only the religious and political, but all the feelings, the personal feelings toward, there was just animosity and hatred, and there was just so much on both sides. Finally, the Samaritans built their own temple on Mount Gerizim within their territory. And not only that, but they took this Pentateuch, the first 5 books of our Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy, the books of Moses, and they made their own Pentateuch. It's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. And especially in the book of Deuteronomy, you'll read a number of times where God is, through Moses, looking forward to the time when the people are going to cross the Jordan River and go in and possess the land of Canaan. And several different times God will refer to the fact that when they come into the land, at the place where I choose to set my name. Well, when they first went there, the tabernacle was at Gilgal. Later we find it at Shiloh. When Shiloh was overrun in the early chapters of 1 Samuel, it moved to another place, and finally it ended up at Nob during the time of David, until David then built another tent and moved the Ark of the Covenant back into Jerusalem. And Jerusalem became that name, the place where God's name was going to dwell. But in the Samaritan Pentateuch, they changed the wording of those passages to make it indicate that it was going to be not Mount Zion, not Jerusalem, but Mount Gerizim, where God would choose to set his name. And so they built their temple there. And later in John chapter 4, the woman that Jesus is speaking with is going to bring that up. She's going to say, well, you Jews say that in Jerusalem we must worship, but our fathers say that it's at this mountain that we must worship. So the implied question is, which one is right? But that's the background of that, their own temple, their own Pentateuch, their own scriptures. Well, also in the time between the Testaments, one of the descendants of the Maccabees destroyed that temple on Mount Gerizim. And of course, that just added even more animosity to the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans. So when John says there in verse 9 of John chapter 4 that the Jews and Samaritans have no dealings, that's some of the background, and you can see that it's a long-running feud. It's been going on, really the beginnings of it, more than 700 years earlier, and it's only gotten worse as time goes on. So you're talking about a long-running, long-standing feud between two nationalities who are abutted right up against each other, living side by side, so to speak, nations bordering each other. So these passages, though, help us to understand John's explanation that the Jews and the Samaritans have no dealings with each other. But you know, it's interesting when we look in the New Testament to see the Samaritans in the gospel accounts, the Samaritans in the life of Christ. And the first several verses we're going to be looking at, the first several passages, are going to be coming from the Gospel of Luke. We've said earlier that Luke oftentimes seems to go out of his way to point out how Jesus reached out to other people whom the Jews normally would have considered untouchable. In other words, he went out of his way to draw in other people. One notes these first 3 passages from the Gospel of Luke. Look at Luke chapter 9, verses 51 to 56. This is another occasion where Jesus is traveling through Samaria rather than going around it. He's traveling through Samaria, and as they come to a village, his disciples, they want to buy provisions there and perhaps even find lodging, but the village will have nothing to do with them because they recognize them as Jews, know them as Jews, and they have their face as if they're going to Jerusalem. And, you know, all that animosity, all that hatred, all those years of seething bad feeling and ill will just comes to the surface. They refuse service. Well, James and John, the sons of thunder, Boanerges, as Jesus called them, they said, Master, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy this village? Well, of course, Jesus would have none of that. And Jesus said, he turned and rebuked them. He didn't rebuke the village. He rebuked James and John for having even that desire. And they went on then to another village. Again, in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, we read there one of the more familiar passages, one of the more familiar parables that Jesus ever told. We call it the parable of the Good Samaritan. I guarantee you that Jesus' original audience, when they heard that, they wouldn't have called it that. As far as they were concerned, there's no such thing as a Good Samaritan. That's a contradiction in term. It's not just an oxymoron. That's a contradiction in term. You can't find a Good Samaritan as far as they are concerned. But in that parable, of course, Jesus is answering the question of a scribe who had asked him, trying to trick him, what is the great commandment of the law? Well, Jesus turned the question around and had the man answer his own question. He answered it exactly the way Jesus would have. So Jesus said, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But he, willing to justify himself, said, well, who is my neighbor? Jesus then told that parable, and he finished by saying, now, which of the three, that is, the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan, which of these three was the neighbor to the man who fell among thieves? And if you'll notice, the lawyer, the scribe, didn't even answer by using the word Samaritan. He simply said, well, the one who showed him kindness. And Jesus then ended it by saying, well, you go and do the same. You go and do likewise. But we call it the parable of the Good Samaritan. Notice how Jesus makes the Samaritan the hero of the story. And then we turn on over to Luke chapter 17. Beginning of verse 11, you read where Jesus is in the territory, kind of the border between Galilee and Samaria. And they're met by 10 lepers, or at least there are 10 lepers who are fairly close by, who get the attention of Jesus. And Jesus asks them, and he heals them. But he tells them, instead of just saying you're healed, he simply says, go and show yourselves to the priest. So, because, again, according to the law of Moses, the priest was the one they would show themselves to be judged, to be examined, whether or not the leprosy was real, or whether it was there, or whether it was still there, whether it had left. So go show yourselves to the priest and offer the gift commanded you by Moses. Well, on their way, they realized they're cleansed. Well, the other 9 went on their way, but one turned back to give thanks to Jesus, fell before Jesus, giving thanks to him and praising him, glorifying him for healing him of his leprosy. And Jesus said, well, were there not 10 who were cleansed? Where are the 9? Has not any other one come to give thanks except this stranger or this foreigner? The man was a Samaritan. The other 9 were apparently Jews, but this man was a Samaritan. But of the 10, he was the only one who turned around to come back and give thanks to Jesus. So again, the Samaritan is the hero of that story. Well, we turn over to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10. You'll find there where Jesus is sending out his disciples on what we generally call the limited commission. He's sending them out to go into the towns and the villages where he himself is about to appear to preach to them. But he says that don't go to any of the villages or towns of the Gentiles, and don't go to any villages or towns of the Samaritans. They're left out of the limited commission. He says, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So the Samaritans were left out of Jesus' limited commission. Keep that in mind just for a moment. Look over in John chapter 8 and verse 48. Here we find again, getting back to that long-standing feud and ill will between Samaritans and Jews. The Jews were in a very great and heated controversy with Jesus, and when Jesus continued to challenge them, they finally resorted, not being able to really answer him, they resorted to that age-old trick. If you can't beat them, start calling them names. And they said, have we not correctly said that you have a devil, a demon, and that you're a Samaritan? Now notice, I wonder in their minds which one was the greater insult. As far as they were thinking, it probably would have been a greater insult to be accused of being a Samaritan than it would be to be accused of being demon-possessed. But they threw both insults at Jesus. Like I said, they couldn't answer him logically, so they resort to the ancient means of just calling him names. But then we find in Acts chapter 1, Acts chapter 1 and verse 8, just before his ascension, this is, again, we might call it the second part of Luke's Great Commission. We see it in Luke chapter 24, verses 47 and following. And here in Acts chapter 1, just before his ascension, Jesus charges his disciples to stay in Jerusalem until they're endued with power from on high, and then they will be witnesses. He said, "You'll be witnesses to me in Jerusalem and all Judea and in Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth." Great Commission. Samaria was excluded from the limited commission, but they are included specifically in the Great Commission. And we see it beginning to be fulfilled with them, with Philip's going down and preaching to them in the 8th chapter of Acts. So that's how the Samaritans come across in the gospel accounts. But now, when we get here to John chapter 4, I'd like for us to notice 4 barriers that Jesus demolished in this conversation that we saw it begun here in the first few verses, but we're going to continue with it, Lord willing, Wednesday night. Notice that first of all, he destroys the barrier of national exclusivism. By engaging this Samaritan woman in conversation, he is challenging and destroying the barrier of national exclusivism. Didn't matter her nationality. She's not a Jew. That's okay. Doesn't matter. I'm going to talk to her. I'm going to open up this conversation. I'm going to ask her for a drink of water. He probably understood this is going to cause her to ask some questions, and he is ready to provide answers and to even challenge her thinking and things, but her nationality didn't matter. The fact that she was a Samaritan didn't matter. The second thing that he did, he chose to destroy the barrier of religious prejudice. Again, as we pointed out, the long-standing feud between the Samaritans and the Jews was not based only on culture and race. It was also based religiously. They had their religious differences, and we all know from history, and we know from even more recent happenings in the world, that there can be nothing more dangerous than groups of people who hold different religious ideologies, and they want to force their beliefs on someone else, or they simply hold in contempt and hatred those who disagree with them. And so Jesus, by speaking to her, he destroys the barrier of religious prejudice. The third thing that he does, he destroys the barrier of gender prejudice. In the first century, in that part of the world, it wasn't ordinary that a man would speak to a woman that he didn't know very, very well. In public, when you were just out on the street, men and women didn't converse this way. It just wasn't done. It wasn't acceptable. It wasn't done in polite society. And so here's Jesus in this strange country. He's a foreigner. This woman comes out to the well. He engages her in conversation. And so you might say that when this woman heard this, it's not the fact only that he's a Jew, but a Jewish man. And she even said, "How is it that you, a Jew, are asking me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" It just was unheard of. It just wasn't done. But Jesus broke down that barrier of gender exclusivism or gender prejudice. And then he also broke down the barrier of social stigma. As we're going to see later in the conversation, when he asks the woman to bring bring him her husband, she says, "I have no husband." He said, "You're right. You've been married 5 times, and now you're with a man who's not your husband." And so this woman, and it's very likely, most of the time when the women went out to draw water at the well, they would come in groups. This woman came all by herself, and it may have been that she came at a different time from the others because she was ostracized by most of the women in her town. But Jesus broke that barrier down as well by opening up this conversation. Well, this sets the stage, you might say, for what we're going to be talking about Wednesday night as we look further into the conversation Jesus has with this woman. But as we contemplate just on what we've looked at tonight, think how Jesus challenged people then with their comfort zones. He continues to challenge us today to come out of our comfort zones, to reach out to people that we might normally not reach out to talk with people we might not normally talk to evangelize people we might not normally evangelize, to teach, to reach out, to help, to serve those that we might normally overlook. Jesus continues to challenge us in these areas. Thank you for listening to our program tonight. Lord willing, Tuesday morning at 10:30, we're going to start a study of the book of Ephesians. And I would encourage any of you who want to join with us then, 10:30 Tuesday morning. And of course, we'll continue that on Tuesdays and Fridays for some time to come. Wednesday evening at 6:30, we'll be back to continue with John chapter 4. Thank you again. Until next time, may God bless you and keep you.